Throughout our 30th year, we have been inviting many of you to share your story, to share your testimony, your faith story, to share a little bit about how you came to know the Lord and then how you got here to Christ Community, because we've discovered that even though we've been together, many of us, for 30 years, we don't know each other's story. And in addition, anytime we share our testimony of how we've come to know Christ, it builds us up. It encourages us. It builds all of our faith. And so I'm excited that Teresa agreed to share with us this morning. Teresa, you had an unusual upbringing.
Yes, I did.
You were raised ultimately in Lisbon, right? Is that where you consider?
No, Oskaloosa.
Okay. So tell us the story.
So my parents lived in Lisbon. We had a horse farm, and my dad worked at the Power and Light Company when I was born. And when I was probably 3 or 4, he sold that, and they bought their first business, which was a bowling alley. And I don't have much memory of that first one. When I was 5, we bought one in Oskaloosa, and that was where I grew up.
And you had some unusual experiences in the bowling alley of Oskaloosa that I think we need to hear about.
Yes. Throughout the 18 years that my parents own it, and still to this day, it is haunted. There were 5 ghosts that would make their appearance that would not necessarily scare you, but they were our friendly ghosts. They like to do things like drop the bowling balls, walk down the gutters, just make all kinds of noises, flip machines on at odd times.
And you were up thinking that was like no big deal, normal.
No big deal, normal.
And at that point, you weren't raised in the church.
No.
And hadn't really been exposed in any way.
Right.
And so one of the statements that Teresa made to me was, well, all bowling alleys are haunted. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that's not something I knew. But
I guess I thought everybody knew that.
But because she experienced that throughout her life in various locations that they owned and worked in.
Yep.
And so it was just a part of her life, right? It wasn't something that freaked you out or worried you. It was just like, this is what happens, and we just kind of ignore it.
We just knew if the lights went out, either you wanted to be in there or you didn't. So
some people ran.
Some people ran.
And you harassed your friends with it occasionally.
Yes, we did.
At a young age, you decided to get married.
Yes. I was 19 when I first got married to my high school sweetheart.
And he was from Brazil, adopted.
Yep.
And his family?
They were missionaries. They had adopted him through CCF. He was 11 years old. He was born in a
Not when she married him.
No, not when I married him. He was born in a coffee field. They were very poor, and when he was born, his bladder was sitting on the outside of his body. It's called exstrophy of the bladder, so parents could not afford him and his medical care, so he was raised in an orphanage till he was 11. So at the age of 11, they decided that he needed to have surgery to put the bladder back where it needs to go, which is in your pelvis. So your pelvis needs to be broke. You need to be in a body cast. So he was brought to America and put with foster parents.
And his foster parents were missionaries.
Missionaries. And he's never going to be done with surgeries. He still is having surgeries to this day. So he became a citizen, and they adopted him.
And unbeknownst to Teresa at that time, because of all these surgeries, she was being exposed to the medical community. And later, I'm getting ahead of my story here, but exposed in ways that later would influence her life. Now, at that point, one might think that his missionary parents influenced you greatly during that time, spiritually, but that wasn't necessarily the case yet.
No. Shortly after we married, they were sent on a mission to Seattle. So they worked for the Seattle Peniel Mission for the entire time that we were married.
And at one point, as things got rough, because you did end up divorcing, but you would get phone calls.
Yes. Throughout the marriage, anytime we were having a fight or an issue, like, for example, I had found out that he had cheated on me, and I got a call from her, and she says, God just told me to call you. And I was like, huh? Okay, how'd he call you? So, and that happened several times. Her her and I became very close. She would call me. She just knew anytime that there was an issue going on and that I just needed her to call me and give me support, she knew. Her son was not in a good place, still is not in a good place today. So God would just tell her to call me, and I didn't know how that happened.
And life didn't get much easier for
No.
a while. And we neglected to tell them that life at home was not wonderful growing up.
No.
And you want to tell about that just
Yep.
a little bit?
So when I was 5 and my parents moved to Oskaloosa, the business took a lot of their time. So my grandparents lived with us, and my grandparents raised me until I was in 2nd grade. When I was in 2nd grade, my parents felt that it was my 2 older sisters. I'm the youngest of 3. My older sister is 6 years older than me, and then my middle sister is 4 years older than me. So they had decided that they were old enough to babysit me and take care of me, so they were left with that task.
Somebody's giggling because they've been there. They know what you're about to talk about.
Yep.
So what was that like?
Horrible. Horrible. My sisters were closer in age than I was. I got beat up, thrown downstairs, had Drano put in my Kool-Aid. I had dog food hamburgers that they were trying to serve me. Just beat me up a lot. I have arthritis and 3 spurs in my back right now because of it.
It was not a good thing.
No.
Not a
When
good
I was in
thing.
5th grade, when they threw me down the stairs, they knocked out 18 vertebrae, and I spent 6 weeks in traction.
It was tough. It was
Yeah.
very tough. And then after your divorce, you suffered from depression.
Yes. I did. It wasn't right away. I was going through a lot. Him and I were together for 7 years, and you don't think that you're going to get divorced when you get married, especially when you think it's your soulmate, and found out that he was doing drugs. So his mom had called and told me that I needed to divorce him. She was still in Seattle at the time, and so I divorced him.
And the depression led you to contemplation whether you wanted to live.
Yep. I remember getting up for work one morning. It was about a year and a half later, and it was a Monday morning, and I had been going through a lot of medical issues and just felt like I didn't want to be around. Thank you. So I took a bottle of pills and tried to overdose and ended up in the hospital.
And who helped you with that? Who found you? Or did you reach out for help?
At the time that it happened?
Mhm.
Oh, we didn't talk about that.
No,
Okay.
just short.
Very short. So I remember when I was laying there, and I had been passed out, and I didn't hear anything going on around me, and I remember seeing a light, and I remember walking towards the light, and my oldest nephew, Zach, actually walked in front of me, between me and the light, and said, "Where are you going? We need you." And I woke up, and then I called for help.
Thank God. Thank God. Well, it was upsetting to you. You didn't have the American dream. At that point, you had a failed marriage.
Yep.
It looked like you might not have kids. You were getting older, and you
Mhm.
wanted to be a mom.
Yep.
And that continued to wear on you.
Yes. I was diagnosed with endometriosis and ovarian cysts at the age of 26.
You met a man that you hoped would be the one.
Yep. I had moved to Oklahoma about a year after my hospitalization for my depression, and that's where I met my second husband.
And from that marriage came
Brady.
Brady that we
Yep.
all know and love. Brady was part of our mission. He came for a day and a half
Yep.
as part of our mission work and rocked it. He was awesome. But that marriage was very difficult.
Yes. He was very verbally abusive, financially abusive. I endured 2 years of being controlled, locked in the closet, yelled at, had things thrown at me while I was holding the baby, threatening to leave and disappear with him and never see him again. So it was rocky.
So after you decided to leave that
Mhm.
marriage, where did you end up?
When Birdie was, I think he was 10 and a half months old, we had went on a vacation to see my parents in Oklahoma where they were living, and we come back, and We had a scuffle at the car, and I ended up driving off, and Brady and I ended up in the domestic violence shelter for 6 weeks.
And that was hard.
It was very hard for me.
I think we have a tendency to think, well, I would never let that happen. I would leave, and I would, but until you've been in that situation and been in that emotional abuse.
I had been trying to leave for a year, and I just could not get out the door.
And that made the difference. But then you lived in fear because he continued to threaten both you and the baby.
Yep. Until the divorce was finalized, which that was in December of that year, I was looking over my shoulder, getting out of my car at the apartment, looking over my shoulder, just worried because I didn't know where he was, didn't know if he was following us.
And it was during that time that you felt some sort of tap on the shoulder, as you didn't know what to describe it at the time.
Yes. So back up a little bit. When Brady was born in October of 2004, he went septic within a couple of hours and ended up in the NICU, and we almost lost him. I had a urinary tract infection, and I didn't know it when I delivered him. Did not find that out until I was actually in nursing school. Nobody wanted to tell me. And so he ended up in the NICU for 10 days. After that, when I got home, I just felt this pull back to the hospital. Like, I missed it. I wanted to be there. I was there for 10 days. It felt like home. I wanted to be there. And I kept getting this tap. You need to go to school. You need to go to college. Because I wasn't allowed to work. I was at home with Brady. And about a month after we came home with him, I got this almost like a shove that was like, you're going to go to school to be a nurse. And I was like, huh? No. I can't do that. I can't do blood. I can't do needles. No. And I kept getting that tap and getting that whisper. And I was like, oh, no. So I told, at the time, my husband that I wanted to go to school to be a nurse, and he laughed at me and told me I was too stupid to do it.
So at that point, it wasn't going to happen,
No.
but the call had begun.
The call had begun. Being in the shelter was life-changing for me. It humbled me. Still didn't really know who this God person was. Knew something was going on, but my heart really changed. My parents went around much growing up, but we had everything that we ever wanted growing up. So I went from this spoiled, rotten person to knowing what was real in life, what was necessities, what was wants. And I needed that before I entered school. While I was at the shelter, I filed for divorce and custody of my son. And one of the things that my lawyer had said to me when I was in conference with him was, what are you going to do? We got to prove income for you. You've got to be doing something. You can't just be at home with your son. And I said, well, I wanted to go to college. And he's like, then go. I was like, no.
Scary. You'd been told for many years that you weren't able to do that.
Yep. So he gave me a deadline to sign up for school. And he's like, I don't care what you sign up for. If you don't want to go for nursing, just sign up for something. So I went off to Kirkwood and started talking and ended up signing up for classes. And I started nursing school, doing my prereqs in January of 2006.
So when was it, who did you first go to church with? You first went to First United Methodist, if I remember right.
Oh, yes. So I had been in school for a while, and divorce was finalized, and my son was, I think, about a year and a half. And at that time, I was talking with with Brady's grandma that lived in Oklahoma. And they were coming up to visit and stay with us, and she was a Christian. And I had told her, when you come up, I would like for you to help me find a church. I want to raise Brady in a Christian home. I had no idea what that meant, just knew that's what I wanted. So she came up, and Brady was going to the First United Methodist Church, Caring Corner for daycare while I was in school, and I thought, well, we can just start there. So the night before, that Saturday night, we drove up to the church and we looked at their sign, and it was confusing. We had no idea what time, what service was and what this service was.
A lesson for all of us, because as she told me what the sign said, it was like, well, it said contemporary service at this time and traditional service at this, but when you don't know anything about Christianity, what does that mean? So I remember her saying to me on the way in, well, we'll just go where God tells us to go. And I'm like, huh? Okay.
So we got home, and the next morning we got up, and when I first moved to Cedar Rapids, or the Marion area, I lived across the street from Linn-Mar High School in those apartments. And I had remembered at that time that there was this church that had been built on the corner, kind of down the street. And so I said to her, well, why don't we go there? So that's where we ended up coming here.
By God's grace.
Yes.
By God's grace. And that you remembered that that had happened even was incredible. So you started coming to church. You got connected with a group that at that time we called home groups. We call them Wesley groups now. And began to be mentored as to what it looked like to be a Christian. What was that like?
Very scary at first. Had no clue what I was doing. I remember, I got to tell the story how with Brian, because that kind of all plays in. So we're going to back up just a little bit. My brother-in-law passed away at the age of 39, 13 years ago, and we were at his service, and there was a lady that was speaking, and there was a gentleman that was playing the guitar, and I had remembered at the time, my sister and my brother-in-law had 3 kids. They were 12, 10, and 5. And I had remembered during that service that I really felt connected with the lady who was talking. And I kind of thought to myself, oh, I wonder if she has a church. And so the time that I had went with my mother, my son's grandma, to find a church, and ended up here from the time my brother-in-law passed away to the time I walked into Christ Community was about 30 days. And we walked in the door and sat down, and it was, I think, 10:15. And I remember there was a gentleman up here speaking, and we apparently were late, and then they got done speaking, and then all of a sudden I heard this lady talking. And I looked to Patty, which was my mother-in-law, and I said, that's the lady that was at my brother-in-law's funeral. It was Becky. She didn't know that until I told her that yesterday. So Becky came out and talked with us and visited with us, and we kind of put the puzzle pieces together and very quickly and realized that she had remembered me from the funeral and asked about the kids. And so every Sunday that I would come, Becky always made sure to find me and check on me and see how things were going with me and with my niece and my nephews and with just the family with Brian's passing. And one day she was like, you need to sign up for a home group. And I'm like, huh, okay.
I love when people do that when I tell them to do things.
So I just kind of followed her lead, and so she's like, oh, I think this would be a good one for you. So she signed me up to go to the Geyers, and I nervously walked in that night. It was just like this feeling that everybody was like, hey, where have you been? We've missed you. And it was like very unusual for me because I wasn't used to that. Very inviting, very welcoming. So that's kind of where I settled in.
She told me that they used to pray with someone in the hot seat, put somebody in the center and lay hands on them and pray around them. And it so freaked her out because she'd never experienced anything like that. But then you were going to school, you were raising Brady, life was happening around you, and pretty soon you were begging to be in the hot seat.
I was. School got in full swing. The first hurdle that I had to get over was the cadaver lab.
We would have to get over that hurdle also.
Yeah, I did a lot of praying on that.
So they prayed you through.
They prayed me through.
They prayed you through.
Yep.
And sitting in the front row when you graduated.
Yep. Ken and Marilyn Gooding were sitting there when I graduated, walked across the stage and was pinned. Sundays I would go at the kneelers and be prayed over. Before I took my boards, I think we had 20 people around me laying hands on me, praying with me before I took my boards, which I passed.
By the way. It was pretty neat.
Yeah, it was.
And what I love is the demonstration that shows. We have a lot of conversation about what discipling means. It's a word that's kind of an official church word, and we talk about, we want to disciple one another, but what does that mean? It really means mentoring, loving, being involved in each other's life, and that's what that home group did in your life.
Yep.
And it reached out a hand when you didn't know what it meant, any of it meant, and made you one of their own.
Yes. I had been going for a while, and I don't know if it was the enemy trying to make me feel like, well, that's not where you belong. It's just church. It's not everything that it cracked up to be. And I remember I skipped Thursday night, which was our night for home group, because I was planning on quitting. And I came to church that Sunday morning, and it was like every single person that was at my home group, hey, we missed you. Where were you? Are you coming next week? We're glad that you're here. Every single one of them greeted me that day, and I was like, how did they know that I wasn't coming back anymore? And I remember I was sitting on the floor out in the narthex, getting Brady's coat on to leave, and Marilyn came out, and next thing I know, she's sitting on the floor with me, talking with me, and kind of just scooped us up off the floor, because I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know anything about this Christian thing. I don't know about this God thing. I'm trying, but it's not working, so I'm not coming back. So that's when she became my Stephen minister.
And walked along with you.
For a long time.
And has become a dear, dear friend
Yes.
who prays for you.
Yes.
And that kind of fast forwards us right to today.
Yep.
And we thank God that you walked through that door,
Yes.
and all the people that were put in your life along the way, that just kept nudging you and
Yep.
moving you.
Yep.
And now you're discipling others.
Yes.
And now you are a nurse taking care of other people. Tell them what your job is now.
Oh, goodness. I am the clinical manager for Kindred at Home. We are a home health agency, so I manage all of our staff clinicians, which is physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, nurses, and bath aides.
And she gets to pray with all of her staff.
Yes.
And encourage them and love them in the way that she has been loved. And so thank you, Jesus, for Teresa. Thank you all that mentored her and believed in her and knew that Jesus had a plan for her life. Thank you, Lord.
Thank you.